Perfect. All right, and I will
Thanks.
pass it over to you, Yasser, for our first networking activity. I'll set up breakout rooms. Will you walk us through what we'll be doing?
Absolutely. So for our first activity, we thought that we do an activity called Roses, Buds, and Thorns, and we um, we thought it's a great idea for us for you to get to know each other and build a community. And we've left in the activity here, found lots of questions, but feel free to choose only one in your room. So questions like right. So questions would include like something that brings you joy or uh, something like in your teaching practice that you've struggled with. So feel free to play around those ideas together. Um, we will be we'll try to exclude anyone who's not able to join a breakout room, but if you end up being in one, please feel free to come back to this session. Um, and I'm gonna post in the chat the activity, and until Dani is ready with the breakout rooms.
I believe that I've captured everyone who said they wished to be in a quiet room. However, if I didn't capture you, or if you hadn't had a chance to let us know yet, just stay back in the main room and we'll make sure you end up where you want to be. Oh, all right, I'm seeing. Bear with me one moment, folks. Okay, so your rooms will be opened, and this is a very quick activity. So you'll be in your room only for 5 minutes, and then we'll bring you back into the main room.
The chat is not. So for our next part of the session, we thought of just introducing the key ideas in the session, like disability justice and ableism and open education. Uh, I want to acknowledge that disability justice is very much one of those concepts that are defined differently. And what I chose here does just reflect our own understanding. It's not really something that this is the solid definition and it cannot be defined otherwise. Um, we've chosen a couple of definitions. One is from Oxford Review, and the other from um, um, the Commission of Disability Equity. So I'm gonna read both, and maybe if any of you has any kind of insight or you want to raise hand and talk through any idea in those definitions, we welcome that. So the Oxford Review says that disability justice is a framework that recognizes the inequities faced by disabled people, especially from those marginalized background. Um, and it also goes beyond the legalistic approaches of disability rights and focuses on the intersection of race, gender, class, and other social identities. Disability justice emphasizes collective liberation, ensuring that all all disabled people, regardless of background, have access have access to opportunities, resources, and social participation. And I love that because it personally it aligned with the social model in some way. It just places some emphasis on the social part, and it also acknowledges the marginality in the whole world. The other definition adds, and I'm not gonna read it like verbatim, but I'm gonna say my reflection here. It adds the idea of our bodies being unique, and I also love that because the disability experience is pretty different, and it comes in different forms, especially like in bodily interaction or in like how the body responds to the disability. So I'm gonna pause for a second and see if somebody wants to add something or if there's something in the chat. Danny, is there anything in the chat?
Just one question about Creative Commons license on the presentation, which I said we'll update with Creative Commons information on the first slide. Nothing about disability justice.
Right. Um, okay. So Sins Invalid is one of the best resources that set the principles for disability justice. They are the ones who I think wrote significantly about them, and I'm gonna also explain them here. There are 10 principles, and I'm going to talk about them in just a brief way. So, intersectionality is the first principle, and it acknowledges that the person has multiple identities and that each identity can be understood with like can be a site of privilege or oppression. And I think that's also important because disabilities can be multiple. Disabilities can range from like severe to being um, less severe, or can range from being chronic or temporary. And disability identity is also very important. The second is leadership is the most impacted. And I love one of the quotes from Sins Invalid, which says that we are led by those who know the system. Um, and this is a great quote because um, disabled people always ask for leadership that knows about disability, not read about it, not heard of it, not understood it in ways that are uh, theoretical only and not based on lived experience. The third is anti-capitalist politic, and I think that this is really great because the whole world is very much based on capitalism, and I take the time here to acknowledge the world atrocities that are happening in the whole world, and I think it's all based on capitalism. But this principle says that we disabled people are anti-capitalist as the very nature of our bodies, mind, and interaction. We disabled people resist conforming to a capitalist normative ideology that is based on the level of production of how we are introduced to the world. We also, disabled people, don't believe in the human worth in the dependent term, or something that is based on how much a person can produce. And I think this is really important also because I want to reflect on this in an educational point of view, that a disabled person is just a person. They reflect how the they do things, not that how much the things are done. Or, for example, if I am as a blind person do something, this doesn't mean that I do it because I'm blind. or because this is what is assigned to me based on my blindness, but it is based on how I do it as a person. The fourth principle is cross movement solidarity, and I also love that because cross movement solidarity uh, shifts how social justice movement understands disability. And I think that this is really an important point. I always read the work of social justice writers like Sarah Lampert, and I love it very much. And I always hear that it aligns a lot with disability, even though it might not say that explicitly, but the work really aligns with disability. Um, so the fifth principle that we have here is recognizing wholeness. But I just want to say, I just want to pause and see if there is something in the chat.
There's no new comments in the chat, yes, sir.
Right. Um, so recognizing wholeness, I think that the the term is really speaks for itself. So the values of us as disabled people is is uh, is our wholeness. And Tins Invalid say that uh, we understand that people have inherent worth outside of our own like disability or our own medical condition. The sixth principle of sustainability, and also this speaks about how the disability experience or that disabled people as a community want to sustain the advocacy and want to sustain the pace of our existence as disabled people, both collectively and individually. Commitment to cross disability solidarity. That means that we, as disabled people, value the participation of our community members and that we value any experience, be it chronic illness, be it dealing with multiple disabilities, or be it dealing with something that is also like a flare or something like that. Um, Dani, can you mute the... Right, thank you. So, and the eighth principle is interdependence, and this this recognizes that before the massive um, 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 colonial projects within European like frameworks, disabled people wanted to understand the nature of the interdependence within the community itself. So how disabled people see liberation of all like the living systems that have existed long before like the before coloniality. Um, the ninth principle, collective access, and I also love that one personally because it talks about the flexibility of experiences, and especially for Black people or brown people or uh, the crib environment or like crib. And we're gonna talk about that when we talk about ableism. And it talks about also the capacities of all disabled people. Disabled people will ask in collective access to for people to take responsibility of our access needs, and that it is not to be like a checkbox. Collective liberation is the final and last principle of the principles of disability justice, and it asks the question of how do we move together as people with mixed abilities. And I also like that question because it recognizes the difference in our experiences altogether. Um, and it honors the long uh, uh, movement of resistance and of resisting all the capitalism, of inaccessibility, of all the issues surrounding disability. Um, I just wanted to also say that disability justice for on that like idea of collective liberation is just a way for us to recognize the other nine principles. Because disability justice here is like a vision, and it acknowledges the different understandings of each person's capacity. Um, I'm gonna give the floor to Dani so she can also talk about ableism and uh, and CRIP.
Great, thank you so much, Yasser. So as you can see, disability justice it's a very kind of complicated framework that was grassroots rooted in disability communities who are seeking this collective liberation. But essentially what it is it's a system that is designed to first name and then challenge ableist structures, understanding that ableism is sort of inherent in all of our societies and all of our social structures, and very much so in our educational spaces. For the purposes of our presentation and how Yasser and I are coming to this, we really emphasize that idea of intersectionality, and take a more broad definition of ableism. This is from Talila Lewis, who updates it every couple of years. But she defines ableism as a system of assigning values to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This systemic oppression leads to people in society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth or living place, in quotes, health, wellness, and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. And importantly, Talila Lewis emphasizes that you do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. So, very much so, understanding disability justice is rooted in the experiences of disabled people, but also understanding that ableism is this intersectional experience of society and social designs, deciding who does and does not belong in these spaces and who can or cannot be rendered capable in these spaces. When we bring this to academia and thinking through academia, ableism is rampant in academia. From the Canadian context, somebody who speaks a lot about this his name is Jay Domage, and he talks about how ableism is embedded in not just like course materials, but in institutional policies, in practices, in the very language that we use to talk about people and bodies, and in other norms that are spread across our educational spaces. He argues that the reason that we need to move towards accessibility, or Yasser, my argument, to move towards disability justice, is because these normative designs of our educational spaces are inherently inaccessible, and they do define who doesn't or doesn't belong in a space. So accessibility helps us expand the boundaries of belonging, who can succeed in educational spaces. Another disability or critical disability scholar, Margaret Price, similarly argues for accessibility, but really emphasizes the fact that accessibility requires acknowledging different experiences of reality. So, as Yasser was talking about the cross-disabled experience, there isn't a singular experience of being disabled and experiencing inaccessibility. And if we want to be truly accessible, we have to acknowledge that there is difference. Price also emphasizes how social structures are really shaped by capitalist logic, and ableism is rooted in a productivity model of human worth, suggesting that humans only hold value so much as so they can contribute to social progress, can contribute to the economy. And that's really the root cause of ableism, that if you are not a quote unquote productive human, you hold less value, and our systems don't need to cater to the needs of those people. Price also emphasizes that because accommodation systems in education are rooted in this idea of productivity, accommodations are meant to make people more productive. They inherently actually impede rather than support access because they're inconvenient. They create additional points of labor. So they require emotional labor, they require time labor, they have a high monetary cost. So these are all the things that we're hoping, and we know we don't have that much time together. We're hoping to sort of unpack and disentangle and thinking about how we create educational spaces and designs.
And something here that is not on our slide, but as Danny was speaking about accommodation, I just remembered the term access fatigue. And this is where if disabled people keep asking for accommodation, then they really get fatigued to the extent that they feel like uh, burnout. And there is a disability advocate called Holly Tuke. I'm gonna link to the blog shortly. She talks about disabled burnout, as in the idea that disabled people also need to have some rest. And yes, they love to advocate for their rights. Yes, they love to have a space for where they are empowered, they are acknowledged, they are recognized for what they do, but they also should have a space where it's liminal, where they can show vulnerability, where they can show that they don't want to do any of that. Um, we wanted to also, tie this all together. What I said about the principles and Danny said about ableism, and put you in breakout rooms and ask you, where do you see ableism shaping what access looks like, and how might thinking access through a disability justice lens. So how that changes your own approach, how it changes your teaching and learning, how it changes even your understanding. So we want to spend some time in breakout rooms thinking of those couple of questions. And as Danny said, there is no right or wrong answer. It's just us reflecting together on these trends. I'm gonna post those in the chat, and we can go to breakout rooms. And definitely there is a breakout room activity, a quiet room.
And so before I open up the breakout rooms, I just want to acknowledge that Jim's already started the conversation a little bit in the chat by sharing how they impose an ableist agenda on themselves and those around them by trying to prove that as a 73-year-old person, they're still useful and socially productive. And I think, Jim, that actually really, thank you for sharing. I think that really encapsulates this idea of ableism. Ableism also is not something that necessarily that others are imposing on you. There is a lot of internalized ableism that people experience because we're trying to strive for these unreasonable ideas of productivity outside of us. So thank you so much for sharing that and highlighting that. As you think about this, where you see ableism shaping what access looks like, it's also worthwhile to kind of look inside yourselves and see how you might be practicing ableism in ways that might not be very visible to you. For the breakout rooms, I'm going to put folks, I've remixed them a little bit. If you had previously indicated you wanted to be in a quiet room, you're still in the quiet room. If you wish to move into a collaborative room, please let us know. If you wish to be moved from a collaborative room to the quiet room, please let us know. But otherwise, we'll put you back into your rooms. And again, for just 5 minutes to kind of talk through some of these questions.
On first. So welcome back, everyone. Um, so I hope everyone has had a lovely conversation in their breakout room. Feel free to share in the chat what stood out to you from that. Before we transition to the open end part, feel free to raise your hand or something. And I'm gonna share the blog post that I was talking about, that one of the disability advocates from the UK wrote on disabled burnout. I'm gonna share that in the chat. And uh, yeah, I'll share that in the chat here. And feel free to raise your hand. I see Irene has her hand up, so go ahead, Irene.
Yeah, one of the things that we actually touched on was the fact that in discussions, there's never enough time for inclusion or anything to do with gender or accessibility, because other things are put as on the list, higher on the list. So, we were suggesting that it's about time that we started putting inclusion and accessibility and gender and the other things that we think should be included at the top of the list. And so we don't run out of time to discuss about these things and have them as a priority and not a by the way. So that was my highlight. Thank you. Back
I
to you,
love
Yasser.
that. I love that. Danny, I wonder if you have reflections about that. But I really love it. I agree 100%.
It always seems to be, especially like conversations about inclusion seem to be like the side conversation, and like the last thought instead of integrated in every piece of it. We see that a lot, like very administratively in job titles. Like we have people whose job titles is like the equity, diversity, and inclusion so and so or officer, and those are the jobs they get cut first instead of making it part of everyone's job, Irene. So I think that's similar to what you're talking about. When it's separated, it ends up at the bottom of the list, which is very, very problematic. And also just acknowledging some of the things in the chat. So Heather shared that part of their conversation was around internalizing ableism. Related, I think that connects back to what Jim had shared earlier on. And then Lara shares, we talked about learning materials being inaccessible as a default and how the burden is often on students to self-advocate. So this might be exhausting for the students. Thank you, Laura. Like the idea of accessibility, the labor of accessibility is such an interesting conversation. And who takes on that burden of labor, which is often when it's students, becomes unpaid, invisible labor too. Yeah, so I
Yeah,
don't know if you want to add anything.
or even those, yes, or even those people who uh, are just regular users and they keep testing things and reporting uh, to the developers. It also takes time, and I don't say that every developer should just pay people, but I say that every developer should at least respond to the inaccessibilities that is reported to them, because it is just also a labor that we were talking when folks were in breakout room about the applications that are accessible and then they become inaccessible by the time or by time, and they become inaccessible not because of something but updates. It's just when people update their applications, they just forget accessibility and leave it behind. So yeah, I appreciate the comment, Laura, about the accessibility of learning materials. So, any other interaction or any other insight?
There's nothing else in the chat.
Right.
So perhaps we'll move into the next section, which is really what we were hoping to do today was sort of tie together disability justice with open pedagogy. Open pedagogy is a little bit harder to define, so we're going to invite folks actually to help us with defining it. I'm going to put the link to the presentation slides back into the chat. There's two ways that you can participate in this. So I'm going to invite everyone in the main room, no breakout rooms, but to take 2 minutes to think about the following question. What is a defining characteristic or defining characteristic of open education? And there's two ways that you can answer. You can either share your contribution in the chat, or if you want to jump right into our slides, help us co-create the slides, very aligned with open pedagogy. On slides 12 and 13, there are a number of blank text squares, so you're welcome to jump right into the slides and add your answer onto those slides. So what I'm going to do is just show you. Yeah, so if you go into the slides on the left-hand side, you can navigate to the slides, and on slides 12 and 13, there's lots of spaces where you can add your answer to the question, what is the defining characteristic of open education? And while I'm here, I'll also fix my grammatical mistake. Thank you for joining us, Laura. Give folks another minute if you're still thinking it through. You're also welcome to look at both slides 12 and 13 and see what other folks are adding. All right, if you're still adding, please continue, but let's talk through some of the things that have been shared here. So a lot of what's been added here is tied to cost. So we see affordable, subsidized, or free. We also see things about how flexible things are. So flexibility, adaptable, not unintentionally restricted. We also see collaborative, shareable, accessible to everyone. And I'm going to come back to this when we actually talk about later on open washing and what is accessible and not accessible. We also see things about student agency, accessible in terms of physical, economic, cultural, and legal. So lots of different forms of accessibility being encapsulated under this idea of open education. Again, we see free of cost, that it can be revised, and then we see things in terms of format so that it's multimodal, it applies universal design. For folks who might not be familiar with universal design, it's designing things so the maximum number of people are able to use it. So lots here in terms of how we understand open education. The fun part of this conversation really is that open education is a very amorphous term. So two of my favorite definitions are open pedagogy is dynamic, contested, constantly under revision, and resists static definitional claims. This is from DeRosa and Jiangiani, or Jiangiana. And then Nell Noddings and Enright said, by its very nature, open education cannot be fully delimited or defined. So there's sort of this meta layer of it's open education, which means it's amorphous, it's flexible, but the definition itself is also problematic. So with this in mind, thinking through the actual principles of it, it's not as easy to delineate this as it is with the disability justice principles, which come from a very clear background and have one rooting. And there are lots of different people thinking about this in lots of different ways. The principles that I've pulled together here come from a couple of different sources, but really emphasize not just this idea of adaptability, but sort of more at the structural level of what it's trying to do. So first, thinking through student agency and democratic knowledge production, open pedagogy really is about positioning learners as producers of knowledge, not just as consumers of knowledge. This means giving them the ability to make decisions, to actually construct knowledge artifacts, and really be involved in them as agents rather than objects in the learning process. We also see the naming of power as a key part of this. So, understanding that openness has inherent risks. These risks can be unevenly distributed with regards to vulnerability in how you share things, how openly you share things, who you share them with. Also, thinking through privacy and visibility. For some of us, we're in positions of more privilege where it's easier to be open, and for others, it's important to be less open because of how that opens you up to vulnerability, to harm. Also inherent in open education is thinking through collaboration, interconnectedness, and reciprocity. So understanding that knowledge is not owned by a singular person, but it is produced through conversation, through dialogue, through working with others, and requires mutual support, expansion, and these ideas of community. Really important is also respect and transparency. So in consumer societies, there's this tendency to sort of take for yourself. Respect and transparency really means that we preserve the knowledge lineages of information. We name where things came from, what knowledge traditions they came from, what communities they came from. And this also very pragmatically means when open licenses are applied, respecting the attribution requirements of the licenses of the materials that we're borrowing from, respecting copyright, respecting authors' right to choose how their knowledge is shared and who it's shared with. Increased reach is also really core to this. So when we think about an open classroom, it's thinking about how knowledge and learning activities are or are not contained within that classroom. And an open pedagogy invites ways to expand the impact and the reach of those learning activities beyond the boundaries of the virtual or digital classroom. Invites learners to work within larger networks beyond their classmates, beyond their institutions, and giving them the opportunity for greater impact. Really core to open education is also resistance and critique. So open pedagogical practices deliberately resist capitalist narratives, very similar to what we talked about with disability justice. They resist approaches to knowledge that commodify knowledge, that emphasize speed and individualism. And they resist the positioning or imagining of education as a means to an end rather than an ongoing process. So open education very much leans into the process of knowledge creation versus the product of a knowledge thing at the end. And finally, and a lot of folks would refer to this as sort of the core of open education or open OER enabled education is renewability and the 5 Rs. So one practice of open education is tied to producing openly licensed materials that can be reused, revised, remixed, redistributed, and retained. So it's creating things that other people can build on, allowing you to enact all of these other principles on these actual knowledge materials. Oh, Maha, yes, I might have had a typo and I will go back and fix it. I don't know if it's on this slide, but I think this slide matches what you spelled here. And Jim offers, I think an interesting challenge is determining to whom we want to be open in our instance, but the danger is the blindness we have on ways we are closing against people we should want to include without realizing how we are doing so. Absolutely, Jim. I think you raise a really interesting point here as well. Sometimes folks who practice open education assume that the more open, the better. And I think I think there's a lot more nuance that needs to be involved in these conversations on who we are opening up to, how that can introduce kind of value or benefits, but also the potential harms of opening up to different people. But also thinking about when we are too closed, who are we excluding, what voices are excluded? So there's a lot of nuance to kind of these conversations around how open and to whom. In terms of actual impact and sort of open education in kind of social justice examples, I'm going to pass it back to Yasser, who's going to share 2 examples of open education projects that really align with these principles.
So, yeah, thank you, Dani. Before I share the projects, I just want to say that I have read extensively many resources and I've tried to find a resource that talks about, like, that aligns with open ed and disability justice, at least to my own understanding and satisfaction. But I actually I couldn't find something on disability itself, but the projects that I'm going to share are very much accessible and they embody what we call what we talk about in disability justice. So the first I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to post links on the in the chat, or Danny, if you can go to our documents and grab links, that would be great. So the Higher Education for Good book, which is edited by the by our uh, Equity Unbound members, Laura Vernovich and Catherine Cronin, which Catherine is our Equity Unbound co-founder. Actually, this book is one of the books that invites global perspectives because it has 27 chapters authored by people from all over the world. It is accessible. It is accessible, so there are a lot of formats for the book, including an HTML format, which is actually accessible to people who use screen readers, and there is a customization in the website to just view it in different ways. So I think that aligns with every disabled like learner who wants to read. Um, it actually promotes equity, inclusion, and social justice in the core ideas of the book. Um, the authors share a lot about like equity and inclusion and all that. And the book is open access, so it's available freely and available to anyone in the whole world for free. Um, the other project is the digital open textbook for development, and it's a project housed at the University of Cape Town, the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Innovation. It's led by Glinda Cox, and it also talks about open access ecosystems. And um, it's also like the resources there are accessible. So the website is accessible to those who have screen readers, so it can also be adapted. I've seen some examples of the open textbooks there. Um, and it's also one of the projects that are transparent, retained, and also available freely and open access to the whole world. So I'm gonna pass it back to Danny. So if there's something in the chat or if there's a comment, then so she could continue as well.
May's just said I love the cover for the Higher Education for Good cover, I'm assuming, which is either a river and ocean with a small rowboat with a tree growing out of it. So it's a very evocative cover. Um, so we're hoping to invite folks back into your breakout rooms now that we've sort of chatted through disability justice principles. We've presented some potential principles, not the definitive principles, but some potential principles for open education and open pedagogy. And in your breakout rooms, we'd like to invite you to think about, where do you see alignment between these two frameworks? Where do you see opportunities for the frameworks to enhance each other, to support each other? But also inviting a bit of reflection on, where do you see the potential for friction? So where can these two ways of kind of reconceptualizing education or society, where can they butt heads? So we'll put you back into your breakout rooms. This time we'll put you into your breakout rooms for 6 minutes. Irene, hopefully that's enough time for your chat, but there will be one more breakout room activity. And again, if folks wish to switch from a collaborative room to a quiet room, from a quiet room to a collaborative room, let me know. By default, I'll put folks back into the room that you were in. There, I do have to shuffle people around a little bit, but your room should be opening now.
Welcome back, everyone. We hope you enjoyed the conversation.
couple of the conversations are holding on to the last second, which is always a good
Yeah.
sign.
I think we've got time to hear from somebody if somebody wants to share, right, Dani?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think everyone's back with us now. So if anyone would
Welcome
like to share
back.
back, either in the chat or raising your hand, we'd love to hear how your conversations went. We'd love to hear if you had enough time for the conversations. I'm guessing maybe not, but would anyone like to share back?
We can also stop the recording, by the way, if somebody wants to share off the off recording.
We would also invite reflections. I know some folks are choosing the quiet room, but maybe are engaging and sort of reflecting on these questions themselves. So we'd also invite any sharebacks from folks who are in the quiet room thinking through these things on their own. I might start the conversation and then if folks want to jump in. But a couple of the ways we've thought through some of the synergies and opportunities for these two frameworks to support each other. Both focus on rendering individuals or learners capable. So they're sort of really about challenging access or challenging kind of ideas of ableism by making it so that more people are able to engage in learning, are able to engage in knowledge production, are able to engage in sort of social practices. Both value individuals or learners as knowers and knowledge producers. So they shift expertise and sort of institutional ideas of who holds expertise and whose expertise is valuable drastically by positioning folks who might be sort of left out of those visions of expertise as knowledge holders. They both aim to challenge capitalist ideas of productivity, value, and success. Part of this, I think part of the conversation has been this idea of going more slowly, this idea of what does it actually mean to be a member of a community? And is that really only inherently tied to the productivity value that we bring to the community? So both frameworks aim to sort of unravel some of those underlying assumptions of how we do things. Both frameworks invite collaboration, collectivity, and interdependence. So they're really built on this idea of being in community, working with others, relationality as a core underpinning. And they're both interested in changing systems, not merely surviving in them. So, in stark contrast to an accommodation model, which is really about making the system change just enough so that some additional people can become members of the system as it is. Both disability justice and open pedagogy want to change the system to make it so that more people can thrive and not just survive. And I will pause here and see if anyone else wanted to add any other things that maybe aligned with your conversations in your breakout rooms, if you had things that perhaps I'm missing here on this slide and this overview. But we'll pause and see if folks have anything else to add to this.
Um, we had a conversation around assessments, which is always a big topic in all institutions and quite a number of spaces. And we were thinking, when will we have assessments that are that consider the diversity that is in a class, where we don't use the same method for everybody, where the assessment is inclusive and test the knowledge that the person has on this, but not based on one theory, or one understanding where people can bring in their thoughts and they still are correct, not just that one thing that was shared by the lecturer or the teacher. Yeah,
And
we had an interesting conversation around that. Sorry, yeah.
did you come up with any sort of approaches to being able to do that, Irene?
Elsa, can you help me?
Yes, I was just starting to type in the chat, but basically, where you design your assessment so that every student can demonstrate the knowledge that they've gained or the skills that they've learned without having to have these extra accommodations. It's not terribly specific, but that's where we were headed.
I think I recently have been involved in conversations where we're talking about sort of the way that learning outcomes decided by the teacher perform and how they're a problem. So what you're saying there, Heather and Irene, I think is really nice because you're asking learners to define their own learning instead of trying to align it with somebody else's determining what learning is or what the goals are. Which I think is it's a great way of reflecting both on disability justice and open pedagogy because it's about learner agency. They get to choose what they learned. They don't get someone else to tell them what they learned. If I'm understanding what you're saying correctly. Acknowledging the chat, Jim shares that David provided a great insight on alignment. Open collaboration widens the participation in creating accessible content beyond the skill of a small team of developers. Yeah, absolutely. I think that also like the specialized knowledge needed to create things like open education definitely challenges that. Thank you for sharing, Jim and David. Somewhat related to that point, actually, the one thing that we wanted to highlight was um, inaccessibility is open washing. So I'm going to share a story. I've been involved in a number of open education projects, or projects that have been called open education projects, but haven't necessarily been open education projects. Including a series of openly licensed modules built and a proprietary tool that was incredibly expensive. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with Articulate Rise. This is not a critique of the tool. This is a critique of open washing. But the tool is very, very expensive. It has its own format, so it doesn't create flexible formats that you can edit in other platforms. You can only edit in this platform. So on this project, we spent tons of time creating these materials, put an open license on it, and then had a very strong introspective moment where we realized that the materials that we had created were inherently inaccessible because you had to have a lot of money to buy a license to be able to create a copy and edit them yourself. And this is one example of open washing. This happens a lot in my space where a lot of people will put open licenses on things that are not easy for other people to edit. What also happens if people create openly licensed materials that are not accessible, that do not have like basic digital accessibility applied to them, like captions, like alt text, like descriptive images, it limits who's actually able to access those materials and to apply the 5 Rs, who's actually able to revise them, to redistribute them, to use them. So our argument here is that true openness requires accessibility. If you are trying to engage in open pedagogy and creating open educational resources, but they are not accessible, that is not really open. Because inaccessible materials and designs limit agency. They limit who's actually able to engage in revision, in using those. It makes some learners illegible and voiceless. So it strips out people who are able to contribute to those knowledge practices, and it does redistribute power in the space. So this is something that we really wanted to position because often and way too often I see people calling things open, saying that they're open, but completely disregarding accessibility, which makes it a very closed or very sort of narrow definition of who's allowed to have agency in those spaces, replicating a lot of these things that both models should be arguing against ableism because it does render some people incapable. Recognizing a couple things in the chat. Irene, thank you so much for joining us and contributing. I'm sad to see you go, but glad you were able to come for the time you were. Laura says, as a regular Rise user, I fully agree. I will start using the term open washing with my team ASAP. Yeah, and again, it wasn't like Rise has a lot of great features, Laura, but it's just not open. And then Maze offers, this is so helpful to hear. I'm so grateful for this nuanced discussion. Thank you, Maze. Yeah, this is really the point of intersection that we were hoping to highlight in today's session. So this takes us to our last activity, and I'm going to pass it back to Yasser to walk through what we're going to invite folks to do next.
Before I do that, Dani, I just want to also align with what you said about, with something that has to do with disability and specifically screen readers, that for people who use the Windows operating system, there are two screen readers, or in fact three, but the third is not really widely used, which is like the narrator originally built on Windows, but no one uses that because the capabilities of its functioning is not really that good. So there are the job access for speech, JAWS, uh, job access with speech, and there's NVDA, which is the non-visual desktop access. Both screen readers, the JAWS is not open. It's pretty expensive. I mean like uh, annually you pay like a couple of $1,000, or even more for some countries, whereas the other one is open and there is a space for developers to create add-ons for like to improve certain inaccessibilities with certain apps. So open washing can, what I want to say here is that open washing can also be in the tools and not only in learning materials or in resources or even in like instruction like LMSs or instructional design. It can be in the tools or programs that we create or deal with. Uh, so I just wanted to share that. And it's just not on the slide. It's just a story that came up in my mind. Finally, our final activity is the co-design, and
Actually, Yasser, do you mind if I add to the story that you just added?
right.
I'm doing a lot of work with algorithmic bias in AI. And I recently came across a similar situation where the tool was purported to be accessible. It was a tool that was voice to text, and they were promoting it as an accessibility tool. But for folks who had different speech impairments, it simply didn't work. So it was promoted as an accessible tool, but for anyone who had different speech patterns, it would not actually translate their speech to text. So they were deemed even like they were further disabled by this technology being positioned as an accessibility tool because they were probably part of the target audience, but it hadn't been trained on their speech patterns. It had been trained on like a very narrow vision of who speaks and what voice sounds like. But very similar to what you're talking about, Yasser, where it's another example of rather than open washing of accessibility washing, where it's saying like this is accessible, except if you really need it. But that just came to mind when you were sharing your story, Yasser.
Yes. So thank you for sharing, Dani.
And then
So
Dahlia in the chat has just said that they like the idea of open washing. It really shows how we might think something is inclusive while it actually isn't.
a lot
So
of things are as such, and this is why we try to always align things together. And this is why we say that open education is often good when it just does the 5 R's that we spoke about. So for our final activity, we originally had planned to give 30 minutes for that, but time will not give us the possibility of doing so. So we have 9 scenarios that Danny is going to walk us through, and they're just very vague situations in higher ed uh, or in even teaching or learning generally. And we want you to think about how we want you to co-design some practices that align with disability justice principles and also open education. So we want to tie everything together in this final activity before we close out. And I'm going to refer back to Dani so she can also draw on the scenarios and explain them further.
So given that a couple of folks have dropped off, I've trimmed it down actually to 6 scenarios. And the way that we'll invite folks to participate is rather than us putting you back into rooms, you'll have the choice of the room that you wish to join. So you can either choose to work in one of the exemplars we've created. There is one room that's called Choose Your Own Adventure. So if you have your own kind of pedagogical problem that you want to work through, you could join that group. And then there will also be a quiet room where you can work either on your own materials or one of the other exemplars or scenarios that we've given you. The scenarios that we offered are just meant to be sort of broad pedagogical problems that folks might come across quite often. So first is if you're creating an assessment to be resistant to AI misuse. I imagine that most of us have been in a room where that conversation was happening. Actually constructing the online course environment, so choosing the tools and technologies that form that online environment, providing feedback to learners, creating a course policy on academic integrity, selecting course materials, and then finally there's the choose your own adventure room. Once you're in your room, what we would invite you to do is you might be with people you haven't chatted to before, encountered before, so just quickly introduce yourselves. Spend some time framing your pedagogical problem. So there's a couple of questions just to give you a bit more nuance to the problem. And then consider your pedagogical problem through the disability, justice, and open pedagogy guiding questions. I'll walk through what those guiding questions are in a second, but I'll also share a document where you can work through your pedagogical problem together. And then finally, to wrap up the session, we'll invite people back in the main room to share back, but only if you'd like to. Based on our conversation today around the disability justice framework and the open pedagogical principles, the guiding questions that we're offering you to think through these problems are, how can you increase student choice and agency? How can you redistribute power in this learning environment? How can you expand the definition of expertise or knowledge? How can you reduce access barriers? How can you create opportunities for relationality, interdependence, or collaboration? How can you extend the reach of the learning activities beyond the classroom? How can you resist capitalist narratives and ideas of productivity and success? And how can you make the learning process more transparent? Before you panic and go, wow, that's a lot of questions, we're not asking you to answer every question. We're asking you as you think through the problem to kind of pick the questions that maybe seem most relevant, most interesting. These are meant to be a guide. This is not, the task is more thinking through the pedagogical problem and trying to apply at least some of these principles to it. So we will put folks into breakout rooms in just one moment. I do want to share a document with you. Where there is space for you to work through your pedagogical problem. Let me make sure it's an editable link. In this document, what you'll also find at the beginning of the document, actually, why don't I share my screen so I can show you the document? We have provided the actual definitions of the principles that we talked through for both disability justice and for open pedagogy. So I'm just bringing up on the screen now the document. And so at the very first page of the document, there is your table of contents. But then at the beginning, we've provided a definition of the principles of disability justice, as Yasser explained them, a definition of the principles of open pedagogy, as I offered them, and then below is the activity itself. And if you do wish to work in the quiet room, you're welcome to choose any of the different scenarios, and you can work in the bottom of the document or just think through the prompts. So before I put folks back into breakout rooms, are there any questions about the task? Stop sharing. I will open up our breakout rooms. So this will be a little bit different than when we opened up breakout rooms previously. Now you'll be invited to choose your own breakout room. They are labeled with the pedagogical problem. Given our numbers, we might find that some of the rooms are more populated than others. So we'd invite you, if you end up in a room by yourself, but you weren't hoping to be by yourself, you can choose another room and move around.
And if you have any needs that you would need us to move you, let us know as well. We're giving 15 minutes for this, right, Dani?
Yes.
All right, so for 15 minutes and we're gonna share back.
Back yet? Oh, there they are.
Welcome back. We hope you had a nice 15-minute conversation. So that was the longest activity for the session, but we hope that you enjoyed it and met some new people. I think we have a couple of minutes that we can hear from somebody or just read through the chat. So feel free to go ahead and tell us what did you glean from the breakout room activity. And we're gonna have a share back right now that really does that. But if something that stood out in your conversation and you wanna let us know about that, feel free to do that.
Just to give folks a bit of encouragement, I'll just read the questions aloud. You can choose to answer one or just broadly, sort of if there's anything that stood out to you in today's session that you might be able to take back to your practice. But in your rooms, or if you were working independently on one of the pedagogical problems, where did you find success applying the principles of disability justice and open pedagogy? Where did you find challenges, or where did you kind of encounter sticky bits? Or what practices can you take back to your own context? So we'd invite reflection on any or all of those questions.
And maybe I think I'm gonna pause or stop the recording here and let everyone speak freely. And for people who are watching the recording, thank you so much. Also feel free to, we're gonna be attaching the slides and the document with the resources, and feel free to go ahead and contribute. I'm gonna pause the recording out here.